I would strongly recommend sealing a paver or using a paver sealer, firstly to protect your pavers. If you don't protect them, they can be damaged by freeze-thaw attack, water getting in and expanding, freezing and expanding and cracking the pavers. Salts and chlorides can get in and damage those pavers. Mold and mildew, if you're in a more tropical climate, that can get in and damage the pavers or make them unsightly. So I would strongly recommend sealing just to protect your pavers. Secondly, to make them easier to clean. If you've got a sealed surface, then at least you have a fighting chance to get any solutions, any oils, any food stains off the surface before they soak in and are in there much more permanently. In order to get the absolute seal, the best seal to stop any staining, any solutions getting into your pavers, then I would recommend a topical sealer. Something that puts a thin film, puts a barrier across the surface of the paver. That'll give you much more what we call an absolute seal. The second consideration is what you want the sealer to, or what do you want your surface to look like. If you want to enhance the surface, if you want to bring some color to it, give some sheen, or bring out the colors that are in your pavers, then a topical sealer again is the choice. If you don't want to change the appearance at all, you want to just keep the natural look but still maintain a seal, then the choice there is a penetrating seal. So instead of a topical sealer, you've got a penetrating sealer that soaks into the paver, into the capillaries, into the pores, and fills them up and lines them up, and basically repels any moisture or any oils that may want to get down into the pavers. But it's not an absolute barrier. Okay, this top surface is open, so that you still can get some staining, but it gives you what we call a fighting chance. It gives you much more time to get in there and clean it and pressure wash it. So it'll certainly make it much easier to clean than you didn't seal the pavers at all. So penetrating is your option if you don't want to change the appearance, but it is not as good a seal as a topical. Then the next choice is whether you go with solvent based or with water based. Okay, we have solvent based topical sealers, we have solvent based penetrating sealers, and then you also have water based topical sealers and water based penetrating sealers. Now the difference between a water based and solvent based really is in terms of their sensitivity to moisture. The solvent-based sealers tend to be a lot more sensitive to moisture. So if your pavers are damp, you can't get them to dry out fully, then you could run into problems of the sealer turning white or leaving like a milky residue or appearance on your pavers. You don't get that with or less likely to get that with a water-based. A lot less moisture sensitive than a solvent. The other thing is about the solvent sealers is they tend to burn off quicker. They may give you an initial shine, initial high gloss, but they will lose that appearance much more quicker than a water-based, and you don't get the same longevity with a solvent as you do with a water-based sealer. So in short, I would push you towards water-based, and then you then have to make up your mind whether you want a penetrating or a topical. If you want an absolute seal, I would push you towards a topical sealer. If you don't want any change in appearance, that's your main criteria, then I would go with a penetrating. A water-based sealer is a sealer that uses water as the carrier agent as opposed to a solvent. We use water to take the polymer, to take the sealer material into the paver and onto the surface of the paver, as opposed to like a solvent like xylene or acetone. Of course, it's much safer to use water-based than solvent-based. You don't have any flammability issues, you don't have any odor issues, so much easier to handle and work with, especially if you're indoors. Also, the water-based sealers, when they evaporate off, they tend to last longer and are less moisture sensitive than a solvent-based sealer. So the differences when using a polyurethane sealer versus an acrylic. Well, polyurethane are typically much tougher polymers. They're much more cross-linked, bonded together, and provide a tougher, more permanent barrier that is much more UV resistant compared to an acrylic. You can use an acrylic, very popular. They're UV resistant, but they're more sensitive to moisture. They're not as strong, not as tightly cross-linked as I just mentioned, so they will tend to break down and wear off faster than a polyurethane-based paver sealer. The best water-based sealer, in my opinion, is a polyurethane, a water-based polyurethane, two-part sealer, something that mixed together, chemically reacts, cross-links, and forms a very tough barrier across your paver, across the paver, soaks into the sand, locks everything together. That will provide a much more durable, longer lasting seal than a one component single component acrylic sealer. The things to look for in a sealer with a wet look is, first of all, to make sure that it's not moisture sensitive. You want to check that it can be used on damp surfaces, or you don't have to wait an extensive amount of time in order to apply it. The sealer will milk. If it's sensitive to moisture, it will go cloudy, and it's very difficult to remedy. So you want to look for that. I would recommend a two-part, something that you mix together that will form a tight cross-link film across the paver and into the sand and lock everything together. I'd look for water-based versus solvent-based. Solvents tend to be very moisture sensitive again. Of course, they're more hazardous to use, and they also burn off. They don't keep that wet look or that sheen for as long as a water-based sealer. And a two-part water-based will last a lot longer in terms of sheen and wet look than a one-part. You have to be careful when trying to use a water-based sealer over a solvent-based. You could get a situation where the solvent-based will reject the water-based sealer. If it's been applied very recently, then I wouldn't recommend using a water-based sealer over that solvent-based. So if the solvent base is, let's say, less than a year old, then you need to be very careful, and I wouldn't recommend top coating that with a water based. I would go and top coat that with a solvent based. If it's more than a year old and it's what we call weathered in that situation, then there's a possibility of top coating that with a water based, but then I would recommend using two-part urethane, something like our StrongSeal WetLook, which has much greater adhesion, that has this cross-linking chemical action that would bond better to a weathered solvent-based sealer. Failing that, then really you should strip that sealer, strip that solvent-based sealer, and go directly with your water. Can you paint over a water-based sealer? That's something you have to be careful about. The water-based sealer, the function of the sealer is to repel water, it's to repel solution sticking to it. So it can be a challenge to paint over. You'd have to use something that's certainly something like a two-part urethane or an epoxy if you're inside, and would require you to sand the surface, lightly sand the surface, rough it up to give that paint, that epoxy paint or that urethane paint, something to stick to. Using a latex paint I wouldn't recommend. I would suggest that you strip. There's much more of a chance of you getting adhesion failure between the water-based sealer or the paver sealer and the latex paint. So how soon or how quickly you apply a paver sealer, there's a number of considerations. Obviously you have to clean the paver, and you're going to be using moisture. If you use a sealer that is moisture insensitive, something like our StrongSeal WetLook, then you can seal pretty soon after you've cleaned it, within 1 or 2 hours. You don't want the water to be sitting on the surface, but the sealer can be damp. If you don't use a moisture insensitive sealer, for example a solvent-based sealer, you may have to wait 24 hours before you can seal. So there's a big difference. It's unlikely that you can seal the same day. But using something like the StrongSeal WetLook, you can seal the same day, soon after you pressure wash. Doesn't matter if the pavers are slightly damp, just make sure you don't have any puddles or pools of water. The other consideration is about the sand. If you're using sand between your pavers, if you're using regular sand, coarse sand, then you can use our sealer and it'll lock everything together. If you're using what they call polymetric sand, then you need to, that needs to be wetted down, that needs time to react, and I normally say wait 24 hours for that to do its thing before you seal it with any sealer, including our sealer. How long it takes a paver sealer to dry really depends on the temperature, humidity, really the elements, and whether you're inside or outside. So outside, a paver sealer will dry pretty quickly, within a couple of hours normally. Inside, it's going to take longer. You've got less air movement, more temperature difference than you would on the outside, okay? Or cooler temperature than you would on the outside. Once you get below 70 degrees, everything takes longer. So whether you're inside the property or outside the property, just paver sealers take longer to dry. So figure on average 2 to 3 hours outside, maybe 4 to 5 hours on the inside, but keep in mind that's 70 degrees. Once you're below that, things are going to be push out, could take twice as long to dry.